to welcome our colleagues and panelists for today. I'm really pleased to be joined by colleagues from CGAP's Gateway Academy, along with our evaluation partner from IMC Worldwide. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Tom Sinclair, who is a Senior Operations Officer at CGAP and the CEO of Gateway Academy. Along with Tom, we're joined by Jason Wares, and Jason is the Director at IMC Worldwide, who's been supporting the monitoring evaluation workstream working with us. And Christy Amaka is a consultant at CGAP's Gateway Academy, and briefly you'll be hearing from each one of them. And it's such an honor to have them joining us today. Welcome, Tom, Jason, and Christy. So in terms of what you can expect in today's session, we will look at Gateway Academy's experience with developmental evaluation. The Gateway Academy team needed to effectively conduct evaluation in a dynamic and complex environment, and to have an evaluation approach that would support and inform innovation. So how did the team navigate this business need? Tom will guide us into that question and provide us first with a brief overview of Gateway Academy, especially the complexity and the dynamic environment in which Gateway Academy operates. He'll explain why Gateway Academy chose to take a developmental approach, and then he'll also help us in understanding and defining and explaining what developmental approach evaluation approach is and how it differs from the standard evaluation approach that many of you may be already used to, and when developmental approach is particularly relevant. Tom will then be followed by Christy, who will explain to us how Gateway Academy used a phased development and some of the data sources that were informative and that were used. And in particular, she'll look at how the team-wide participation in our evaluation approach was helpful. She'll share some of the lessons learned and the action items that followed that phase. Then Jason from IMC will follow Christy, and he will help us understand the next phase of development, particularly where the offerings within Gateway Academy featured full courses. And he'll address the value that digital learning presents to its stakeholders. And so Jason will give us some insights from digital learning stakeholders such as the learners and HR practitioners that have so far been part of Gateway. And then Tom will follow that by concluding and sharing with us what's going on in the current phase that we are in, some of the modifications and developments that have been made, and what's also next for Gateway Academy. He'll share what we've learned and what's also necessary for successful developmental evaluation. So Tom will also help us address the question of digital learning sustainability. Towards the end, I'll join you later on to facilitate the Q&A. And I'd like to remind you that you're welcome to please note down any questions and comments that you have and that you'd like our panelists to respond to. So without waiting any further, I'll hand over to Tom, who will give us a brief introduction to Gateway Academy and tell us what the developmental evaluation really means. Well, thank you, Tom, for joining us, and over to you now.
Thank you, Panina. So to begin, talk about Gateway Academy, just give you a little bit of background. So Gateway Academy is a curated digital learning marketplace for financial inclusion. When we started this work a few years ago, we began with a premise that capacity building market for financial inclusion wasn't working. Training in particular was too expensive, so we pursued a digital learning pathway as a way of closing the gap between supply and demand, bringing down the cost of learning and increasing capacity within financial service providers to address the needs of the poor. Through developing Gateway Academy, we've created an innovative learning offering for a dynamic market. We did this through an agile and iterative approach, so our offering could adapt in response to our growing understanding of and changes of the market. For more about this, you can see our last webinar entitled Demystifying Partnerships That Enable Competitive Advantage, where we talk about our agile approach. So we designed a solution in response to market demand while facilitating the development of links between the supply of training and between that and market demand. So it's important to know that we have so far focused in 7 sub-Saharan African countries. We've worked in Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Malawi, and Zambia. And it should also be noted that Gateway Academy is designed to be a spin-off from CGAP to become a self-sustaining entity. When we think about our work in building out this marketplace, we think about more than just supply and demand. We try to take into account all of the components that are necessary to create change. We're not necessarily responsible for each component, but to understand how it is all working together, we needed more than a standard evaluation approach. A standard evaluation approach assumes a clearly defined problem, a specific solution, and it evaluates how well a team implements that solution. Our situation was too dynamic and complex for that standard evaluation approach to work well, so we went with a developmental evaluation approach. Let's now look at what developmental evaluation means for us, what it looks like, how it differs from standard evaluation, and when we think you should do it. So first, let's look at a definition by Michael Quinn Patton, an expert on developmental evaluation, and he says that it is an approach that supports innovation by framing concepts, testing quick iterations, and tracking the trajectory of the innovation. Developmental evaluation is particularly oriented to supporting early stage innovations in complex environments. Ideally, it can provide a near constant feedback loop. Standard evaluation processes are linear and provide a process of gathering data, analyzing data, formulating a solution, and implementing that solution. This graph, for example, shows the development of a solution over time using standard approaches. It assumes what is relevant about the problem can be understood up front and assumes that conditions are static over time. Sometimes, though, problems are not bounded. Conditions are not static, and solutions can't be clearly defined or completely known up front. This is the space of innovation, and this is the approach that Gateway Academy took, designing iterations, evaluating effectiveness, understanding resultant changes to the market, and then refining our subsequent iteration over and over. To emphasize why we thought this approach would work well for Gateway Academy, we'll spend a minute highlighting the key differences that were relevant to us between a standard evaluation approach and a developmental evaluation. So a standard evaluation approach seeks to determine the relevance of a project's objectives and whether or not they can be achieved. Where with a developmental evaluation, we don't try to measure only if the project has achieved its objectives, but also it supports innovation and adaptation in dynamic environments in order to achieve those objectives. In a standard evaluation approach, the evaluator is positioned as an outsider to assure independence and objectivity. In developmental evaluation, the evaluator is integrated into the internal team functions of gathering and interpreting data, framing issues, and surfacing and testing developments in the model. In standard evaluations, we try to measure performance and success against predetermined goals. But in developmental evaluations, you create measures and track mechanisms quickly as outcomes emerge, and these measures can change. Standard evaluations require detailed, scheduled, formal reports and validated best practices. With developmental evaluations, you look for feedback that is rapid and real-time and delivered in diverse, usable forms. So a major consideration when thinking about these differences is, what are the circumstances in which you should use developmental evaluation? Developmental evaluation is most useful when innovation is identified as a core value, when things are not static and there is a need for iterative loops to generate options, testing, and selection. When you don't really know what the path forward looks like, when no one has done the things you set out to do. When you have the available resources for ongoing exploration. Organizational culture is also key, and the culture needs to be suited to exploration and inquiry. And that includes the funder, leadership, and staff. So everyone needs to be in agreement about innovation and willing to take risks. We've been lucky on Gateway Academy to have a funder in MasterCard Foundation and management at CGAP who have been with us through this process, giving us the room to test, explore, and take risks. So let me now hand this over to my colleague, Christy Emiker, who will walk you through how we have used developmental evaluation.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. Thanks for sharing about Gateway Academy and why we took this approach. I'm going to talk to you about how that approach went, what we learned, and how what we learned informed decisions that the team made about the path forward for us. So throughout this project, we were constantly learning and adapting, and that was mostly structured through 2-week sprints. In addition, we had larger phases with significant milestones. And at the conclusion of these phases, we would have deliberate periods where we would evaluate, reflect, and adjust our path forward. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to be focusing on these larger phases. So our first phase in 2016 was alpha, followed by demo in 2017. And our beta phase, which began in 2018, is still ongoing. So throughout this project, we learned from a wide range of sources. And these are sort of, we can think about these in terms of time. We had some streams of data that were really one-time research, right? So that was some background secondary research on the market, a demand study, so we could more fully understand what our stakeholders needed. And we also conducted workshops in the different countries that Tom shared with you. And we also had a regional workshop, a collaboration and co-creation workshop, where we gathered people on the supply side, people on the demand side to understand what they needed, and that really informed our path forward. We also had periodic research. When courses would end, we would have learner interviews, learner surveys, and we also had a community of practice made up of HR professionals, and that really helped us understand what they needed. So I would say that the one-time research streams and the periodic research are what you more typically see in standard evaluation approaches. But we also have continual data points that constantly inform what we're doing. That includes data on the platform, key metrics, so we can see how the project is progressing against defined benchmarks. And then especially our team interactions. So when members of our team are talking to potential customers, to banks and microfinance institutions, we're understanding what they need. As we're onboarding them, we're understanding what are some of the issues, what are some of the challenges. And as we're talking to training providers, we're understanding things from their perspective. As you can imagine, with the project data and those team interactions being so important, that evaluation is the job of everyone on the team. And CGAP, the team working on Gateway Academy, had a lot of expertise, but we knew that we couldn't do it all. We initially brought on Creative Métier to conduct that demand study and facilitate that community of practice. To lead the evaluation efforts, we brought on IMC, and the fact that they were removed from the actual delivery of service meant that learners and institutional leaders and our training partners were a bit more open than they would have been with us. IMC also helped us think through what questions we wanted answers to, why, and how we could go about getting them. We also worked with a consortium that helped us build Gateway Academy, and they also contributed to our evaluation efforts. Vivi and Paradigm headed up the platform design and development, and their knowledge of user-centered design and involving end users in design collaboration was very helpful, and that informed our evaluation strategy, as did Humentum's knowledge of digital learning and how we can evaluate its effectiveness. So our first phase was the alpha phase, and we conducted this with initial financial services and training partners prior to building out our own platform. What we wanted to do was understand what they needed and how they interacted with digital learning to help inform what we would build. We worked with 100 learners from 5 different banks and microfinance institutes, and we used 4 sample modules rather than building out complete courses. And this was an approach that Gateway Academy took throughout our work. where instead of building out absolutely everything, we would test these quick iterations so we could then adjust. And we had an overarching question that guided our work in this phase. And that question was, is digital learning possible? So while we're sharing an overarching question for each phase, in reality, we're testing many, many hypotheses, which we then narrowed down and focused over each subsequent phase. But we needed to learn, would digital learning work in this sector, in this context? And that was for entry and mid-level employees in different size banks and microfinance institutes in those 7 focus countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And we learned that digital learning is possible, but there are significant barriers that we needed to address. Now, we thought technology would be a challenge, and it was, but not only in just the ways that we anticipated. We did also find that the people we were working with were highly motivated to address those barriers. So we knew from our earlier research and experience that reliable internet access could be a challenge, but we didn't anticipate how difficult it would be just to get behind banks' firewalls. If you're not familiar with a firewall, it's a network security system that controls web traffic based on different security rules. And so if the site where your content is hosted isn't cleared or whitelisted, then none of your learners can see that content. And that's not an ideal introduction to digital learning. So these were different issues that we had to work through. And in addition, as we're working through these, some of the banks were having trouble getting our emails because they were going to their spam folders or not even making it through. And we didn't know that this was what was going on. We thought that they were just being unresponsive. So this really critical project learning came from those day-to-day project operations. We also used more standard evaluation methods, and that includes surveys. And here are the results of a question that we asked about what represented the biggest challenge to digital learning. And as you can see from this graph, that internet connectivity was the most commonly cited issue, followed by access to equipment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our partners were really committed to overcoming these barriers. So learners having trouble with connectivity would put in more time. They would come early or stay late, times when there was less traffic on their network. One learner who'd been in the field for 20 years would come to the office at 5 a.m. to connect to the course. And one financial institution that we worked with even changed their internet service provider to someone who could provide faster service in order to roll out Gateway Academy. We also asked about access to devices. And as you can see from this table, the majority of learners had access to desktops or laptops at work. But it's really important also to triangulate your data. So when we talked to people, we found that oftentimes these devices were shared. And so they didn't always have access to the equipment to learn during regular business hours. But here too, we saw an incredible commitment to overcome these barriers. One bank, for example, solved an issue of learner access by turning a conference room into a digital learning lab in order to launch Gateway Academy. So what did we do with some of this learning coming out of our alpha phase? A lot of the action items that the team came up with centered on addressing technical and connectivity challenges. So we made sure that we would have an onboarding checklist and documentation and support clearly lined up to help with those whitelisting challenges I mentioned earlier. And it was also really important to have the time for that built into our rollout timeline when we're onboarding a new bank or microfinance institute. We also realized the need for leadership support and a technology contact to resolve those technical issues. And in order to get that technology contact, we needed to have that leadership commitment. So that organizational culture became more and more evident to us as the project progressed, how important that is to success. And we also prioritized the development of our mobile and offline app. You can see screenshots of that right here. We always knew that learners should be able to access Gateway Academy on their mobile devices, but after our initial phase, that became even more evident to us how important that was, and so we prioritized that work. And now I'm going to hand it over to Jason to tell you about our demo phase.
Thank you, Christy. So after the alpha phase, we moved into the demo phase. The demo phase was different. It advanced on the, for the demo phase, we had 100 learners. We were working, we'd moved up to 8 financial institutions in 5 countries, and we were offering 4 full courses rather than just modules of courses that were offered in the alpha phase. And our guiding question in alpha phase was, is it possible? Having learned that it was possible, the next step in demo phase was to ask, is digital learning valuable in this sector? And in this case, we meant value to many different groups that were participating in the Gateway Academy. We wanted to know if it was valuable to the learners themselves, if they felt like they were participating because they were genuinely interested and found value, or if they were being told to participate by a manager. We wanted to know if the managers of the financial institutions and the leadership thought that digital learning was valuable, and if so, was it more valuable than more standard learning? And we wanted to discover what we could do to maximize the value and to support the realization of the value for the different groups that were participating in the Gateway Academy. Some things that we learned were that digital learning is valuable, but we had to be careful how we measured it. In a more standard evaluation approach, you'd want to do a statistically rigorous and complicated study to see where value was showing up. But we learned maybe that it wasn't necessary to go that far to show that it was valuable in our constituent groups. We wanted to know whether or not students were genuinely motivated or whether they were obligated to participate in the Gateway Academy. We learned that as managers rely on some survey of their employees, but a lot of it was that they rely on just the observation of what happens after training to know whether or not it was working. And we also discovered that making the content was very important to create value, but also having a enjoyable user experience was important to create value for Gateway Academy participants. So this slide shows a result of a survey that we did where we asked why learners were participating in the courses. And what we found were that most participants thought it was important to their career or important to their job. So rather than their manager asking them to do it or them feeling obligated because something was missing on their team. And we felt that this was a good proxy indicator for showing motivation, that learners were interested in taking the course because of the personal value that they were gaining from it. This particular survey was based on about 71 learners in 4 different cohorts, which isn't a huge sample. So we did interviews to check whether or not what we were finding in the survey was also true of people who were participating in the course, maybe weren't having as much success as other people in the course, and different participant groups. We found out that it was true, that even that people, no matter what their experience, were expressing value for digital learning in general. We talked to a learner in a bank in Tanzania who said that she had just gotten a new job and it was her first one in agency banking, and she felt like she needed the skills to to participate and be successful in her job. So she was gaining experience and lessons that she was applying directly from the class. Another learner at MBS Bank in Malawi wanted to know more about digital financial services, which included agency banking, to widen knowledge. So it was more than just being able to apply directly. It was also to satisfy personal desire for new knowledge. We also interviewed managers and leaders at the banks to understand if they felt they were getting value, they were getting institutional value, and how they knew. One HR manager in Kenya said, if we could get most of our training in an e-learning platform, the cost would come down. In e-learning, you can train the whole organization. So this shows that the manager valued not only that the direct cost benefits that could be realized, but also the ability to get more people across the organization trained. This HR manager mentioned that they currently used a face-to-face training at an institute which required travel, meaning that they could only train about 3 employees each cycle from each branch, whereas the Gateway Academy would make the possibility for training much broader. Another operations manager in Ghana said, every company wants to see that staff are poised and positioned to take up any challenge, showing that they had more faith that their staff were prepared and had the capacity to manage in a less centralized way, and that was the value that that organization was seeing coming out of the digital training. Through interviews and surveys, we also learned that not just the learning itself, but also the ability to directly apply skills was an important factor of value that organizations wanted to get out of training. In alpha phase, we asked managers how they knew if training was successful, and most answered that they scored staff based on discussing what they'd learned and, more importantly, applying what they learned. In demo phase, we wanted to understand what learners felt were important factors to applying what they'd learned. So the managers valued the application of the skills. We asked learners what could help them apply the skills. And these survey results, combined with interviews that we conducted, demonstrated that coworkers training at the same time in cohort groups together and regular management support to learners engaged in training promoted skill application. By the way, other options on the survey included rewards for applying skills, sanctions for not applying skills, or just relying on personal initiative or easy access to tools and resources. So out of all those possibilities, learners most often chose that working as a team together and having management support were the most important factors in skill application. So this was something that we could apply to the Gateway Academy by helping our FSP clients develop ecosystems that would support skill application. So the Gateway Academy wanted to make sure that we were delivering the best possible experience. So we worked with the team based on the findings, and we conducted modified user tests of the platform itself to make sure that it was delivering maximum value, not just through content, but also through ease and enjoyment of using the platform. We did modified user testing of the platform and the onboarding process, which involved having a researcher sit with learners as they engaged with the platform and asking questions about their choices, why they chose to go to certain links, why they chose to click on certain buttons. We also reviewed and categorized help desk tickets to see what issues they revealed about about difficulties that learners were having engaging in the platform, and we compared these to completion rates. An interesting thing about completion rates was that in some of the courses, completion rates were low, and we wanted to find out why. So we interviewed students who did not complete the course. And first we asked them about the value that they gained from the course, and the great majority of them were very enthusiastic about what they had learned and their ability to apply, which didn't coincide well with their not completing it. So when we asked them why they didn't complete it, they were surprised that they hadn't completed the course, and it turned out that there was a complete button that was on the screen that they had to click in order to be marked as complete, and that they had missed that button. So rather than a content or facilitation issue, the issue turned out to be more of a user interface issue that was more easily correctable. So our action items coming out of the demo phase included changes to the platform that facilitated use and experience, changes to the learner onboarding experience that made it easier for people to log in and create an account. We also engaged more with the financial service providers, making sure that they could access the reports that they needed and communicating with them about the importance of creating an environment that facilitated skill application. We increased functionality to the training providers that allowed the people providing the trainings to access reports and information on the course and its students. And it also affected the design of courses. We moved to facilitated course experience that could grow quickly, that could scale up, that were intensive but not so intensive that they prevented growth. And now I will hand it over to Tom, who will discuss the beta phase, which is the current phase that we are in.
Thank you, Jason. As Jason said, we're still currently in the beta phase, and this phase, as Jason mentioned, is characterized by having courses that are delivered on the platform. They're fully functional courses, but we're still in testing mode, but the courses are fee-based. As we're in beta, we'll share out our modifications and developments alongside what we're learning. So far in this phase, we have had 490 learners from 8 financial institutions taking 8 different courses. The big question in this phase is, will people pay for it? Is digital learning sustainable? So we're testing whether there are enough organizations willing to pay at a high enough rate to make it worth it to training providers to develop courses, and for Gateway Academy to cover its costs. So we're asking ourselves, what level of sales do we need to reach for this to happen? What is the size of the market we need to reach? How many countries do we need to be working in to achieve this? So we're still figuring this out, but we will share some high-level learning so far. As we moved into the beta phase, we started selling individual courses to financial service providers. We learned quickly that selling individual courses wasn't going to work very well. First, financial service providers had difficulty understanding how a course would fit into their own offerings or training needs assessments. They needed to understand the learning journey of Gateway Academy and how our courses fit together and how they could fit with their internal offerings. We also heard that there was a need for ancillary services that we've now built into what we're offering. From the Gateway Academy side, there was also a cost-benefit downside to onboarding individual learners. To bring them together into the platform as an institution and as cohorts meant reduced time and resources on our end. So we developed a tiered pricing structure using bronze, silver, and gold tiers of courses and services. Using this structure, it's easier for financial service providers to integrate blocks of courses with their other learning programs. And we're able to offer those ancillary services that we've now built into our offerings. As I mentioned, the financial service providers wanted to see the learning journey and course progression of Gateway Academy. This part is still a work in progress as we continue to add more courses to fully realize this. Throughout the process, we developed key performance indicators and targets, and we are tracking and sharing these monthly and have deeper dives quarterly. When we fall short on a metric, we look at our data and learning to find out why, and we develop a plan for adapting our work to reach that metric. Revenue progress to date is one example of a key performance indicator we track. Others include the number of paying customers, paid enrollments, course completion rates, key metrics around our supply of courses, and number of training providers, and committed donor funding. So just taking us back to Christy's slide, as we figure out how we measure those key performance indicators, we look across different data sources, including the sort of one-off research that we have done, the periodic research that we continue to do, and the continual data that we collect. And this work, as Christy said before, I just want to emphasize, is done by the entire team. That includes IMC Worldwide. It also includes the CGAP team itself, our partners at Creative Métier, and our consortium partners at Humentum and Vivi. And finally, we have thought a lot about what made developmental evaluation work for us. And we've thought about what enabling conditions might help it work for others. But one key element for us was trust. This meant being open about what does and what does not work throughout the process. And this trust starts with leadership and goes throughout the entire team. It requires removing blame when something goes wrong, but holding people accountable for what they are responsible for. It requires agility in processes and deliverables. It requires understanding what the innovators need to know, how to collect that data in an agile way, and how to deliver it in a useful format. It requires teamwork. Everyone must know that evaluation is everyone's job. From those on the front lines with customers to those on the back end looking at platform data, we all need to be able to spot trends. And a conducive learning culture is necessary. It requires a thirst to learn and a commitment to change based on that learning. It means instituting reflective practices and ensuring the entire team is thinking in a critical way that informs decision making. We believe that developmental evaluation brings evidence to the feedback loop that begins and ends with innovation. Innovation, reflection, evolution, and innovation, allowing us to constantly learn and adapt. At this point, I'm handing it back to my colleague, Penina Lamb.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Christy and Jason, for that interesting sharing of your insights over the last few years that we've run through Gateway Academy. I really want to send another invitation to the entire group of participants to ask you to kindly send me your questions. Our panel is now ready to interact with you, hear your comments about anything that they've shared, clarify anything that may not have been as clear, or even to expand the conversation. And so while I wait for your questions to come in, and please remember how to do it is using the chat function, enter your question or comment and then push send, and we'll be able to see that. So while I wait your questions to come in, I want to start with Jason. As you were talking, Jason, there's something that I noted about the complexity and the dynamism of the environments that we're working in. And I wondered whether you can address this question around to what extent are development projects using this approach, and are there more organizations turning in that direction? What's been your experience with developmental approach? Jason, I hope you can hear me.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, please.
So you're asking about development evaluation in general?
Yes, in general, and whether more projects are starting to or continuing to use a developmental approach, given your experience.
Yeah, I think we've seen a turn to it in the last 2 years, particularly, especially in environments where either there's a lot of innovation going on, like was true in the Gateway Academy, or sometimes in humanitarian environments that require quick reactions to sometimes not complete information, where quick decision making is important to the success of the project. So we've seen it everywhere from inventing new products to reduce water usage that have maybe 5 to 10 year time spans, to humanitarian responses to refugee crisis, where we are in a very dynamic situation and data needs to be gathered quickly and interpreted on a day-to-day basis. So it's certainly the more traditional approach is by far the more common one, but definitely developmental evaluation is becoming more and more needed and popular.
Well, thank you for that, Jason. So Rhoda has a question that she's asked about in our experience, what's been the level of involvement among project participants in the evaluation? That's the students themselves. And I'd like to address that to Christy. Christy, if you can help respond to that question, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Felina. I would say everything is really based on that student feedback, and we have a variety of ways that we collect that. So some of that is through surveys, some of that is through interviews, and then a lot of it too is we correspond directly with learners to give them support as they're encountering any difficulties or challenges with the platform.
Great. And just to extend that, is this something that's ongoing? I know you mentioned a little bit about us seeking input throughout all the phases. To what extent is Gateway Academy now engaging the learners even at the better phase?
So we're constantly asking. So some of that is directly with the learners themselves. Some of that is through their HR managers. And we are also always collecting information on what else people need to learn about and what other courses we need to develop. So there is a sort of ongoing loop for that.
Great. Thank you, Christy, for that. So I'll send my next question to Tom. Tom, if you'd speak a little bit about what the biggest obstacle was in terms of what was the most difficult part taking this developmental evaluation approach, or was it not even difficult?
Well, yes, I think there were some challenges in the beginning that we definitely had to overcome. And so the first challenge was a common understanding of what we meant by developmental evaluation. So people are using it. There are examples, but especially on a particular project, going back to Christy's slide of the data sources and who's involved, it's a bit more complex than just hiring an objective outside evaluator. And so a common understanding of what we mean by this, how we're going to collect data, and who's going to do it was one challenge. Another challenge was convincing people, and I mentioned that we have a great funder in MasterCard Foundation and supportive leadership. But in the beginning, I did have to do some work with convincing people that this method will still keep us accountable, that we're learning and we're adapting throughout the process, but we're also ensuring that we are accountable to what we've said, to our North Star, and certainly accountable with funding and other things like that. But that we need the space to adapt in between there, and so convincing people of that. Those, I think, were the two biggest challenges that we faced.
Thank you, Tom, for elaborating on that. So I have another question, and I can't tell who sent it in, but just let me paraphrase this. Do we have any difficulties getting institutions to engage with this approach over the more traditional evaluation approaches? And if so, how do you overcome these issues? Tom, I think it follows right along with what you're explaining, so if you would please elaborate on that some more.
Sure, absolutely. And I actually will would be interested to hear Jason's take on this too, but I don't think we did, because as we approached them, they didn't necessarily understand all the complexity behind what we were doing. And so we still had some, as Christy mentioned, some traditional data source and data collection methods, such as qualitative interviews and focus groups and whatnot. And so from the outsider, it might not have looked so different. It's kind of the way that we pulled this together. But Jason, I don't know if you had any other thoughts.
Well, I think, yeah, thanks, Tom. I think I could speak a little bit more generally about organizations that want to institute this methodology. IMC Worldwide does evaluations for a number of clients, and often they'll say that they want to take a developmental evaluation approach, and we'll ordinarily do kind of a rapid assessment of their organization to see if they are likely to apply it successfully. And a few things have to be in place. One is that you need leadership in place that understands what they're going to hear and be able to take action on it, make decisions quickly and take action on it. And the Gateway Academy, through Tom's leadership and the project managers, were open to hearing all types of information. They weren't protecting their individual space, and then they were able to take quick action on that. They also understood that we would be sending them information that maybe pointed in a direction here or there, but it wasn't necessarily statistically rigorous data. It may have just indicated that something was a possibility, and there had to be a capacity in the organization to hear information that maybe wasn't necessarily right or wrong, but just merited further exploration. Not all organizations are great at doing those two things, but if you're working for an organization that is culturally open to discussion and that understands when they hear data points, can make evaluations about the strengths of what the data is telling them, then you're likely to apply this approach much more successfully.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. And to extend that, there's a part two to this question. And in your experience, have you found that the developmental approach is more time-consuming or more costly than standard evaluation approach? Jason,
shall I answer that? It's definitely more time-intensive. The cost, it really depends on the type of project that you're doing. Certainly, there are one-time. I can think of traditional evaluations that we've done that have been very, very expensive, and this approach would have been less expensive. So, the expense is very relative. If doing developmental evaluation heads off a mistake that would cost you a lot of money later on to correct, then it may seem expensive, but may actually be much cheaper than traditional evaluation. So I think it really depends on the type of project, but it's certainly it's more regularly time intensive. That's for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for that. So, Christy, I'll send this question your way. And the person asking would like to know how we've provided data back to the learners about what we've learned and how their feedback has been incorporated in the kinds of changes. I know you talked earlier on about the action steps that have been taken, but can you specifically speak to the learners and how we've provided that feedback to them?
So the learners get feedback on kind of their progress through the course, and a lot of the feedback comes through the facilitators of the course rather than, so that's provided by our training partners. In terms of the feedback that gets incorporated, Jason had mentioned changes to the user interface. We also make changes to that onboarding process and our communications with the learners. There's an interesting intersection between what's the Gateway Academy learning ecosystem that we can control and monitor and modify based on feedback. And then there's also the individual courses. And we make sure to relay that feedback back to training providers. And in some cases, they've made changes as well. In terms of the feedback that we get to the learners, so the learners always see kind of their own progress, and depending on the type of course it is, feedback from the facilitators. They also, in some of the course designs, get feedback from others who are enrolled in the course. So there's a sort of social learning component to some of this as well. And then a lot of the feedback where the learners are aggregated and anonymized, relative to other learners in the organization gets fed back to leadership. But again, I want to emphasize that that's not individually attributable, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you, Christy. So Marina has a question that I would like Tom to help us address, specifically about how using human-centered design approach helped cut the cost and development time. And Tom specifically can speak about the quick iterations of modules and not having full courses.
Yeah, absolutely. So we utilized that in a number of ways. So one was the co-creation and co-curation workshop that we did early on. And we brought about 80 partners together in Nairobi at the beginning of this project to really talk through what this could look like, how it might work. And so that was kind of the beginning of looking at what we're going to develop from a human-centered design approach. And then as we launched with our early partners, as you heard, we developed these early modules, not full courses, and we continued to test with them and test different modes and methods of delivering learning. So one method we tested, for example, was this very extensive e-workshop where learners collaborated with each other across countries and across institutions and really got to have a full sort of classroom experience online. But quite frankly, what we found is that wasn't going to work for the areas where we were working because it required too much bandwidth, it required too much time. And so we've settled on sort of a lower resourced version of that where they're facilitated courses, but we can do that facilitation both live and not on when a learner's not online. So, for example, we built an app where a learner, when they're in the office, they can download the material and they can interact with it when they are not connected to the internet, and then upload once they are back in the office or wherever they are connected. And we built that app and we tested it with groups of users. We also did a design sprint with a tech hub in Dar es Salaam that helped us figure out what that app might look like, and also what our white labeling approach might look like with some of the financial service providers there. So all of those different pieces are both part of the larger developmental evaluation as we gathered this data, but also we came at it from that human-centered design approach.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. Jason, I'll send this last question to you, and this relates to the remote location of the learners. How do you ensure the data that's collected in the local areas is reliable? So speak to the reliability of our data, please.
We try, as often as possible, we try to travel to where the learners are to ground truth what we're hearing through the surveys and interviews. So fortunately, we had a staff member in Kenya. We had a few staff members in Kenya, and then we also traveled to Ghana, Uganda, and I think one other country in order to interview people on the ground so that they could check to see that what we were learning was true. We also conducted regular remote interviews, so we would get on the phone with folks and to talk to them about their experience, and it definitely gave a lot of depth to what we were learning through the surveys and help desk tickets and other types of data collection.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to everyone for the questions that you've submitted throughout, and thank you to the panelists for helping us delve deeper through the content. And now what I'd like to do in the next minute or so is I hope that this webinar has invigorated your interest not only in the topic, but also in the work that Gateway Academy does. So I wish to share some key links with our participants today so that in case you wish to learn more about Gateway Academy, I've just texted the link to the Gateway Academy website, where you can take a tour. We have a video there that you can learn more about the kinds of course offerings as well as our partners. And I also invite you to get in touch with us, and you will be able to do all that through the Gateway Academy website. You can try a demo of a sample course as well, and you can subscribe to our newsletter, and we hope that you'll be able to do that so that we can continue to engage with you beyond this webinar. Once again, I want to thank you so much for your time, for staying with us through the hour. I want to thank you